Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1917 diary series on YouTube. It's a chilly September afternoon at, October. I was thinking of Dmitri because we're in September in his diaries, but a chilly October afternoon here in the Portland area on the 8th October 2025. And we are with Dmitri on the 16th of September 1917, which was a Saturday, and he's writing one of his very long diary entries. Not a typical entry, but one full of his thoughts and feelings and assessment of things and an overview of things. So we started with the first text of that yesterday. And what did we cover? Well, you know, he was talking mainly about the difficulty of being in this state of uncertainty, the way his hopes are, going up, his optimism is going up and then crashing, his predictions aren't turning out. And so, yeah, he mentions that by, typically these volumes of his lasted between 2 or 3 months and saying that, I don't know. I have no idea where I'll be by the time I finish this particular volume. And we found out that he had gotten some very good and sound advice from Felix Yusupov, that he'd been inclined to go back to Russia, but that Yusupov had warned him against it, undoubtedly telling him that things were far too unstable. And what else? We heard him say that the whole thing seems unreal. In Persia, it's hard for him to wrap his head around it, and that's certainly understandable. And also an acknowledgement of how lucky he was that he had stumbled into this very ideal situation for him of staying at the British legation with Sir Charles and Lady Lucia Marling. Okay, so I have to be careful or I'll end up going over all of that all over again. All right, so what do we have today? Well, today we're going to be focusing on something that was very, very important to Dmitri when it came to assessing a human being, and that is the ideal of the man of action. So before I start on that, I have some materials to share that are all interesting sources for all of this. This one is not directly related. The Strangling of Persia by W. Morgan Schuster, an American author. Excellent book, and it filled in so much background for me on what was going on in Persia as part of the great game and the wrangling there between different great powers. Very, very useful in understanding what Dmitri wrote about Persia. And the other two I'll reference at the end when we talk about this section of text. Grand Duchess Maria's Education of a Princess, and Steinberg and Khrustalyov's The Fall of the Romanovs, a very, very good book. For me, this book stands out among the many books that have been written on that topic. But anyway, let us go to it. Here we go. When I finished the last notebook of my journals, I tried to summarize briefly what had happened while its pages were being filled, and it turned out to be a very gloomy picture. The main thing that strikes me in everything that has happened since May is the sheer lack of energy or any kind of productive action, leading to an improvement in Russia's situation, her internal and external well-being. Despite all the speeches, rallies, the All-Russian and other congresses, including the State Conference in Moscow, no one has produced results. Perhaps the only person who's tried even a little to shift from words to action is Kerensky. His figure absolutely towers over all the other revolutionary activists. He obviously loves his homeland passionately, and his heart bleeds for her. But recently, it seems to me, having reached the pinnacle of power, he has lost a little of his selfless love for Russia, and the heights of power have begun to turn his head. After all, in just 9 months, he's gone from being an undistinguished member of the Duma, whose speeches couldn't even get past the censors, to the first man in the Russian state, combining the command of all Russia's armed forces with the post of prime minister and actual dictator, exclamation point. But we have yet to see how people will respond to all his appeals and speeches. So there you can see, he's thinking and he's writing at a sophisticated level. This is not the stereotyped version of Dmitri or Grand Dukes in general, of just sort of the vapid, empty-headed playboy. And yeah, I did just a relatively small section here because I want to focus on this ideal of Dmitri's, of the man of action. So Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky, he was only 10 years older than Dmitri. So he was indeed in a heady place as the prime minister, and as Dmitri says, essentially, if not the dictator, then the real leader in Russia. He was, Dmitri was 26, I think. So he was only 36. He had been a Duma member, a member of the Fourth Duma. He spoke out very staunchly and strongly against Rasputin. Politically, he was a member of the center faction of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. So he was not a Marxist. The Socialist Revolutionaries had, they had an active terrorist branch at the time of the October Revolution in 1905. And in fact, they'd been responsible for several political assassinations, including the assassination of Grand Duke Sergei, Dmitri's custodial uncle. But there were some of them who were quite moderate. Kerensky was one of them. Boris Savinkov, who had earlier been the ringleader of the plot to assassinate Sergei, ended up fighting with the Tsarist troops during the Civil War, and then being even affiliated with Young Russia, the same political group in exile that Dmitri was affiliated with. So all very ironic. Anyway, Dmitri calls him a revolutionary activist. And he's right, but also, he was legitimate because he had been a Duma member. Then when the revolution occurred, he'd been first the Minister of Justice, then the Minister of War, and then Prime Minister. And in addition to being very anti-Rasputin, he was pro-war, he was pro-military. And so, he did not want for Russia to withdraw from the First World War and from the alliance. He was very important to him that should continue, and that made him someone who was acceptable to someone like Dmitri. He was a Freemason, which is why when he died in the United States, the Russian and Serbian Orthodox churches wouldn't bury him in an Orthodox cemetery. And that's just sad. There's this paranoia about Freemasonry that I'm more Orthodox, but I don't understand among the Russian Orthodox Church this just, really paranoia about Freemasonry. And in fact, according to David Chavchavadze, it was why his great uncle, Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich, wasn't acknowledged as a passion bearer like the other Romanovs, because a priest or a bishop told David, well, it's because he was a Freemason. Well, actually, I don't think he even was, because he wrote very harshly against Freemasonry in his own writings. But there you go. That is a tangent that I have gone off on. Now we know about Kerensky. So now we see what appeals to Dmitri so much about Kerensky. He was anti-Rasputin. He was pro-continuation of the war. He was a man of action. He got things done. He towers over all the other revolutionary activists. He obviously loves his homeland passionately. Those are, his heart bleeds for Russia. That's high praise. And he had been not totally welcoming to Dmitri, because Dmitri, when he decided that he did want to go back to Russia after the revolution, he applied to Kerensky and had an exchange with Kerensky at a distance, of course, since he was in Persia and Kerensky was in Russia. And Kerensky, wasn't saying, oh, no, you can't come back. He was just pretty much saying, now is not a good time, I'll let you know. He was probably correct about that. And, Dmitri didn't hold it against him, apparently. So let's... so this is interesting, too, the way Dmitri zeroes in on the idea that, well, he's gone from being someone who was basically an undistinguished member of the Duma to now being at the top of everything. And that, yes, that's going to affect a person. So I don't think Dmitri is, wrong about that. Kerensky did, by the way, end up in the U.S. He survived all of this rather miraculously. And he was at Stanford for a while. He was a professor at Stanford. I had an elderly friend, now passed away, who remembered meeting Kerensky. And Kerensky, his background was as a lawyer. And this friend of mine was in law school at Stanford. And I don't know if Kerensky was actually teaching, but he was around. And he met my friend Michael. My friend Michael met him. Okay, so why I brought this today is because Maria has a whole chapter in her first volume of memoirs. Chapter 27 is entitled Kerensky, and there's a picture of the man, because Dmitri wasn't the only member of the imperial family who had an exchange with Kerensky. Maria, even more directly, she went to see him. When Grand Duke Paul was arrested, she went straight to the top. It was difficult, but she finally managed to get an audience, shall we say, a meeting with Kerensky. And Kerensky was being very sort of rude, but on the other hand, he did tell her he would help her. He would do whatever he was able to do to cancel Paul's arrest, to release Paul from arrest. But Maria wrote later that she didn't understand at the time that it wasn't really up to Kerensky, that he, the Bolshevik Revolution was just around the corner, and he was trying to just trying to survive. The Soviets were keeping a sharp eye on him. And there wasn't much he could do if he had shown support for a member of the imperial family. He would at that time have just been, that would have completely destroyed his relationship with the Soviets. So the Soviets being at this time not a state, not the Soviet Union, but the Soviets were the councils or groups of workers and peasants and soldiers. They had their own organizations, so there was a Petrograd Soviet of soldiers and workers deputies, and they were keeping a very close eye on things. Okay, and then the Steinberg-Krystalyov book, it's entirely made up of excerpts from speeches, letters, all kinds of things. And there's this very interesting, the speech that was made, let's see, before the Soviet of Soldiers deputies in Petrograd in, was it May? Or, no, it was March 1917, 29th March, not long after the revolution. And here's what he said. On 26 March, Kerensky appeared at a session of the Soviet of Soldiers Deputies in the Taurid Palace and addressed them as follows. I came here after hearing that people are showing up who dare to express their distrust of me. I and the provisional government are being reproached for indulging the old government and members of the Tsar's family. I warn you all that I will not allow myself to be distrusted and will not allow Russian democracy in my person to be insulted. I ask you either to exclude me from your midst or trust me unconditionally. You accuse me of allowing certain persons from the Tsar's family to remain at liberty. Know that only those who protested against the old Tsarism and fought against it, as you did, have remained free. Dmitri Pavlovich has remained free, for he was the first to fight against Tsarism, preparing the conspiracy that murdered Rasputin. He has every right to remain an ordinary officer in the ranks of the Russian army in Persia. All right, so I don't know if Dmitri ever found out that Kerensky had said that about him, that he was the first to fight against Tsarism, not the first person ever, but the first in the imperial family, I guess. I don't know. It's ambiguous. He just says the first. So that is very, very interesting. And yeah, I mean, Dmitri, this whole idea of energy and action and not just words. We see him strongly emphasizing all of that in 1921 when he was part of the Trepov group. And as far as he could see it, these middle-aged men from the old regime, ministers and whatnot, were just sitting on their hands and talking about you know, how once the monarchy is reinstalled, they're going to go back and it will all be the status quo, but they weren't doing anything about it, and that just frustrated Dmitri to the nth degree. He himself had tried to be a man of action. He'd taken action. It failed action, but to kill Rasputin, and, you know, how is he going to live up to this ideal himself when he's in exile? But yeah, that's something we'll talk about later. I better stop now. You can see how excited I get by all of this. But yeah, so what do we have next time? Well, we have another big issue, another big person. We have Kornilov, a military leader who attempted a military coup against the provisional government in Kerensky, and this put people like Dmitri in a tough spot because they did admire and respect Kerensky and think he had the right ideas, but then Kornilov was, you know, a little more sort of what... Not a socialist revolutionary, let's put it that way. Okay, I'm bumbling, so I hope to see you next time. Bye.